good morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you are listening to our podcast. And yes, this is Evropy, despite we are speaking for the first time in English. I'm happy to introduce you our guest, who is world-renowned lawyer and scholar, Professor Joseph Weiler. Professor Weiler worked for many years as a professor in many respected research institutions and universities, such as Sciences Po, Max Planck Institute, Oxford University, Yale University, and currently he is a professor of NYU. He also served as the president of the European Institute in Florence. Good to have you here, Professor.
It's nice to be here. Not the first time, but it's always a pleasure.
I would like to talk with you about the relation between the national and European judiciary, and of course, the endemic question of ultra vires doctrine. But first, let me start with a broader question. What is EU? Because a lot of our students are answering to this question that it's entity sui generis, which is saying both a lot and both nothing. We have European Parliament, which, according to German Constitutional Court, is not European. We have Commission, which, however, is not the government. We have Council, which is not the Senate or Bundesrat, and we have European Council in the system, which we cannot associate anything with. And maybe second question, follow up. What do you think about Andrew Moravcik's, whether he's right when he accuses us of judging EU too harshly and through our state-centered lenses?
So I don't like the first question because it's a definitional question. And you're right in saying that when people say that the EU is sui generis, it's not saying much. But it is sui generis because it is not a state, and thankfully it is not a state. If you look at the preamble to the treaties, they speak about an ever closer union among the peoples, plural, of Europe. It's very different from federal states like the United States, where the motto is pluribus unum, making from the many one. And that's not what Europe is about, making from the many one. So it's not a state, and God forbid it should be a state. And it's not an international organization. It's a constitutional legal order. It has institutions which no other international organization has. So one really is stuck with sui generis. It's a genus of its own. It's a project, it's a process. And the question is not how to define it, but indeed how to evaluate it as a system of governance, because it governs so many aspects of our life. So the question about Andy Moravcik, who was my student, I want to say something about the discourse about the European Union. We live in a very polarized world. It's true in states, and it's also true in academia. So people like categorical statements. You're either Europhile or you're Eurosceptic.
And sometimes you are both.
Pardon?
Sometimes you are both. If you are from the Czech Republic and going, for example, to Brussels, then you are Eurosceptic, despite you are back home, you are pro-federalist.
Sometimes you are both. But to be critical of the European Union does not mean that you're Eurosceptic. It can come from exactly the opposite position, which is my position. I think the European construct is noble, and it's unique in time. There's never been anything like it. And it's unique in space. There's no other space like it. And because I think it's noble, it's worth preserving and protecting. And in order to preserve and protect, one has to be aware of its shortcomings and weaknesses and speak about them loudly. But the minute you do that, somebody calls you a Eurosceptic. So I don't think we are too harsh in our criticism of the European Union. I think we have to be if we want to preserve it.
Mm-hmm. You think that the current structure of European Union is understandable to normal people who are living by it? Because the level of Euroscepticism in whole Europe is rising.
It's not because they don't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
That's a Marxist aberration, which is called false consciousness. If only they understood it, they would love it. I think they understand it pretty well.
Mm.
And the notion that it's difficult to understand it's also difficult to understand by scholars, and they argue about it. But I don't think that the critique or the criticism of Europe is a result of ignorance. When the Constitution for Europe was rejected, the president of the Commission said, "We didn't explain it well enough."
Mm-hmm.
And that's condescending. It's saying the people are stupid. They didn't understand. And because of that, they voted against the Constitution in France and in the Netherlands. No, they do understand it. And there were things they didn't like about it and didn't want it. So I'm against that Marxist false consciousness. The people are stupid. Bertolt Brecht had a wonderful statement. The people have disappointed. We have to change the people.
Is the EU the project of elites, or it's a project of Europeans?
It's a project of Europeans, but it's governed by elites. Mm-hmm. And that is true also of our states. It's the Czech Republic, it's the French Republic, it's the Spanish Kingdom. If we are Republican in spirits, and we should be, we don't belong to the state belongs to us. But typically, elites are the people who lead it. Mm-hmm. I think that's inevitable. The question is, if the elites who rule it respect democratic norms, etc. And there I think that Europe still suffers from a very deep democratic deficit. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, of Euroscepticism, of populism, is summarized by the most powerful slogan that was used in the tragic Brexit debate, taking back control. And I think, much as one might admire and like and believe in the European construct, nobody can credibly say that, quote, the people, unquote, that the citizens of Europe have meaningful control over the European Union. Mm-hmm. May I say something more about this?
Of course, because I was about to ask you, because after the Lisbon Treaty, the European Parliament was empowered. There is a European Citizens Initiative to ask the Commission to present some legislation.
So your question shows a very, very common misconception in Europe.
I'm trying to play the devil's advocate, to be honest.
As you should. But it's a very weak devil in this case. I want a powerful devil. The idea was Europe was non-democratic because the European Parliament had little powers. And successively, even before Lisbon, in every intergovernmental conference, when the treaties were changed, the Treaty of Maastricht, the Treaty of Nice, the Treaty of Amsterdam, the Lisbon Treaty, the European Parliament got more power. And now it's a veritable co-legislature. Arguably, one could say it even has more power than the French Parliament. But that has not closed the democratic deficit. And let me explain why I say this. We can take our various European democracies. They're all different. Spanish democratic structure is different from the German one, and the German is different from the Italian, and the Italian is different from the Czech, and the Czech is different from the Polish. But there are two primitive, primordial principles of democracy. If you don't see them, you know your democracy is in trouble. The first one is what the British have a beautiful expression: the ability to throw the scoundrels out. I don't like the people who govern me. I go to elections and I can change the government. So instead of Sunak, I want Stranner. We see that in all our democracies. The very primitive ability, I can determine by whom I will be governed. That does not exist in Europe. In elections to the European Parliament, we do not determine by whom we will be governed. And that is a very serious source of alienation. The last elections for the European Parliament were very revealing in that way, because the European Parliament decided we will put forward candidates representing the major political forces in Europe to be president of the Commission. And the party that wins the election, that person should become the president of the Commission. The Christian Democrats, the Popular Party, the PPE, put forward a candidate, Weber. The Christian Democrats won the elections to the European Parliament, and Macron and Merkel decided, no, it will be somebody else. Now, I have no criticism of Ms. von der Leyen, but she was not the choice of the people. So in that very primordial way, when I go to elections every 4 years, every 5 years, every 6 years, I have a major say in by whom I will be governed. And that primordial principle does not exist in the current structure of governance of the European Union. And the second basic primitive principle, if as a result of elections there's a center-left majority, there will be center-left policies. If there's a center-right majority, there will be center-right policies. Nobody has been able to show any consistency in outcome of elections to the European Parliament and the policies adopted by the European Union. So we call that the principle of representation. The first one, I get to elect by whom I will be governed, is the principle of accountability. And the second one is the principle of representation. And when these two principles don't exist, it's difficult not to notice that there is still a persistent democracy deficit. Now, I will illustrate it. In 1979, there were the first direct elections to the European Parliament. And voter turnout was low compared to turnout in national elections. And everybody said, the reason is the European Parliament has no powers. So why should people go and vote for the European Parliament if it has no powers? It's better to spend a day going to the beach. And then they said, when the European Parliament gets power, people will start voting for it because it becomes meaningful. What have we seen since? From 1979, every cycle of elections, the European Parliament had more power. Increasingly, significantly more power. And in every cycle of elections, less and less people went to vote in European elections. How do you explain that? So you can say, the people are idiots, Brecht, we should change the people. You could say they don't understand. But I told you already, I reject this false consciousness, Marxist idiocy. No, the people didn't go and vote because they realized that their vote did not mean anything. It did not mean by whom they will be governed, and it did not mean that they are shaping the future of Europe. Austerity, growth, the critical issues. It's true that in the last election, there was a slight increase in total voter turnout, although still much lower than national elections. But that increase was actually due to Eurosceptics. They wanted to be heard. So there still is a serious democracy deficit. And that's why the slogan, taking back control, was effective tragically in Britain. And that's why we see that Euroscepticism, which once used to be on the lunatic fringe of the right or the lunatic fringe of the left, is now major policy platforms in Europe. Italy, France, Germany, and I'm deliberately not mentioning Poland and Hungary. So it shouldn't surprise us. And instead of pointing always the finger and saying those awful populists, and in some ways they are awful, I am no fan of Viktor Orban, we should be asking ourselves, where did we go wrong? That millions and millions and millions of Europeans are turning their back on Europe and on liberal democracy. So we should be concerned, we should be critical, but first and foremost, we should be critical of ourselves.
I would like to ask you about some idea I was told during my research. One of my respondents actually suggested that, for example, part of the national delegation to the European Parliament should be co-opted from the national parliament, because the national MPs are claiming that the MEPs are not really connected with ordinary voters back in their country, because they are spending most of their time in Brussels or in Strasbourg.
So I'm sure the person who asked you was young.
Really?
Because before 1979 direct elections, all members of the European Parliament came from national parliaments. That was not a particularly good idea. But I think the idea that part of the delegation of members of the European Parliament from a member states could also be sitting members of national parliaments is not a bad idea. It's not a panacea. I won't go to the barricades to fight for it. But it seems to me sensible. Why not? You want to have a diversity of votes. And there's another reason for that. If we look at the structure of governance of the European Union, and we are not in the 1960s or 70s where it was all about custom duties and protectionism, etc. The European Union now governs major aspects of our lives. After Ukraine, even defense. But it's in education, it's in culture, it's in the information society, etc. The big losers over the decades have been the national parliaments. It empowered the executive branch of the member states, the governments, and the administration. If one understands how European decision-making works, it's a huge empowerment of the executive branch of the member states, both governments and administration, and disempowerment of national parliaments. So it's not such a bad idea. It's not the solution to all our problems, but I don't see anything wrong in that proposal.
Do you think that the Europeans actually understand the Europe as their project? Because, and I know that you already answered to this question, but I would like to go further, because we are about to have European elections, and one of my friend, he's working for a political party, and he asked me, or he actually complained to me that they don't have a lot of people on foreign policy, so they have problem with candidates. My first reply was, but this is not a foreign policy, this is the European policy, this is our policy, this is the internal policy. If you want somebody, send somebody who is expert in social security, etc., or healthcare, because that's the topic which will be important for next 5 years, probably.
It's an empirical question. Do the people, the citizens of Europe, really feel it's my union? In other words, in the way I define myself, currently I teach in the United States. We get hundreds of students from Europe. I meet them for coffee and I say, where are you from? Not a single time did a student say, I'm from Europe. They always say, I'm from the Czech Republic, I'm from France, I'm from Latvia, etc. To be a European citizen means that I'm not Italian and European. Being Italian means I'm also European. In other words, the European idea, the European construct, the European identity is part of my national identity. So it's an empirical question how people feel. Who am I to say how Czech people feel about Europe? I don't know. But there is a feeling that they feel much more stronger their national identity than the European identity. So now we can point a finger at them and say these horrible populists, they bad Europeans, etc. Or we could, in my view, be more self-critical and say, why is this the reality? After all, back in the Treaty of Maastricht, we created European citizenship. Nobody talks about it anymore. What we like is the purple passport and Schengen that allows us to travel without stopping at the border. That's wonderful. But does it mean more than that? So what has gone wrong? So two things have gone wrong. First of all, and we can talk about it later because we're in a law faculty, so there are legal dimensions to it, there is the sense that there's no limit to the jurisdiction of the European Union. Whatever they want to do, they find a way of doing it.
That's something what Kuhn-Lennertz actually wrote in 87.
Exactly. There's no area that is beyond the reach of the European Union. And when he wrote it, he was a professor. Now he's the president of the European Court of Justice, or the Court of Justice of the European Union. And the second thing is more interesting in the East European context. If we look at Western Europe, there was a constitutional revolution in the 1960s, which every student of European law knows. European law is direct effect. It's not a law that binds the member states, it's a law that is binding in the member states. It gives rights to individuals. And the European law is supreme. It is absolutely supreme. It's even supreme over national constitutions. In the famous case where this began, Van Gendenlos in 1963, it was a European Union of 6 member states, and 3 of them went to court and objected. The court, in my view, correctly did not listen to the objection and found direct effect and supremacy and all the rest. Why did they accept it then? Why wasn't there?
Why they didn't try ultra vires doctrine?
There's several reasons for this. But one reason was the historical context. The generation of politicians at that time lived on their flesh the horrors of the Second World War. And this was translated into a very noble idea at the time that nationalism, patriotism is a very dangerous concept. Look where it brought Europe. The Holocaust, the horrors of the Second World War, fighting with each other to the death. Dozens of millions of victims of that war. So they were willing to say, we have a national interest, but the idea of Europe should prevail, and the constitutional revolution was accepted. Now, let's take Poland as an example. That's not a fresh memory in their mind. The fresh memory in their mind is 40 years or more of communist rule. You used to have a sculpture here with Stalin. That was in every member state. And what is interesting is the appellation of Stalin was the sun, S-U-N, you know, the sun in the sky, not the son of nations. So communist rule did not only mean an economic system, etc. It did not only mean a travesty of democracy, it also meant suppressing national identity. You are first and foremost communist. you cannot really be Polish, which in Poland being Polish also means being Catholic. So now the Soviet Empire comes to an end, and the people legitimately want to celebrate their national identity, their uniqueness, their specialness, their culture, what makes us different. In Western Europe, in the 1960s, etc., they want to emphasize what makes us the same. We're all Europeans.
Mm.
But historically speaking, I have great sympathy after decades and decades of communist rules that they want to celebrate their uniqueness, their national identity. And Europe doesn't understand that. And because it doesn't understand that, the populists have such a success. Because one of the things they appeal to is this sense of, I want to celebrate my Polishness. Now, it can be exploited. It can be turned to fascism. But I don't believe that 20 million Poles are suddenly fascist. I don't believe that 20 million Frenchmen who voted for Marine Le Pen, who won the last elections to the European Parliament, and probably will win the elections to the European Parliament in June of next year, I don't believe they become fascist. And the way they perceive the European Union is it's suppressing or denigrating or looking down or condescending our legitimate. The only place it's okay to wave the national flag is in a football match. If you say I'm a patriot, people say that's fascism, that's nationalism. So it's a long answer to your short question. It doesn't surprise me if many people in Europe, you asked about the Czech Republic, they feel alienated from the European Union because although we say united in our diversity, we privilege united and we underprivilege diversity.
When I'm listening to you, I'm wondering about another maybe aspect, let's say, because the Western Europe or Western countries, such France or Spain or Italy, after its unification, it was independent state with very often with its own colonies, while Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, even Hungary, well, parts of the bigger empires, which were at least a little, but usually a lot repressed. For example, Germanification of west part of Austria-Hungary, etc. And for example, in my research, respondents actually recall this experience and said, we always dealt with the capitals, with Vienna, with Moscow, and today we are doing with Berlin during the Second World War. Now we are doing the same with the Brussels. We are just trying to get around it. Maybe you know famous fictional character from the Czech Republic, the soldier Švejk. He's trying to somehow just get away from its orders, etc. And my respondent actually claimed that that's kind of our identity, to try to avoid the boss and to try to avoid our obligations.
So, if I understand the question correctly, first I must say that Švejk is one of the greatest pieces of literature ever written. What is it? The brave soldier Švejk.
Yes.
He's very simpatico. You cannot read that or see it on stage and not have sympathy for him and kind of root for him. But here I'm critical of Eastern Europe, because Eastern Europe is always saying the West doesn't understand us, etc. And you described it accurately, and I agree with you, although it is also true for Spain, and to some extent it is also true for Italy. They always very able, if they have good foreign policy, to protect their national interest within the European context. They go to Brussels, yes, we agree to it, as long as it's also beneficial to Italy, as long as it's also beneficial to Spain. Historically speaking, the only countries which said yes, I mean, don't make no mistake, Germany thinks of Germany and France thinks of France. But the German, the French, and the Benelux countries always say we don't only have a responsibility for our national interest, we have a responsibility for the future of Europe. And it's always a nice interplay between exercising these two responsibilities. The East Europeans have never internalized that they are an important part of Europe, that they should play a role not just in protecting the Czech interest, the Polish interest, the Hungarian interest, the Romanian interest, but in shaping the future of Europe. And if there was this change of consciousness in the elites, in the leadership, or let's call it la classe politique, we are responsible for Europe. We are not just responsible for ourselves. It would be a different Europe, but they haven't had that change of consciousness. It's always, okay, the power is somewhere else, and we just have to make sure that our interests are not compromised.
And we can trade it for something.
Pardon?
And we can trade it for something.
And we can trade it for something. So it's a very good, I'm going to use it myself, Schweiks. And that's wrong. And they have to do some soul searching themselves. Just as I said that in Western Europe, people have to, instead of always pointing the finger at these horrible populists and never asking, so where did we go wrong so that populists are so popular? East Europeans should also point their fingers at themselves and say, maybe we haven't discharged our responsibility towards Europe and not only towards ourselves. So I agree with the premise of your question, and I love the metaphor of Schweik.
Maybe another Schweik story. I'm very critical to the Czech Constitutional Court decision when, for the first time in the history of European integration, the Constitutional Court used ultra vires doctrine in so-called Slovak pensions case. We actually use it. We borrow it from the German jurisprudence, and, in my opinion, use it a bit freely. But first, maybe my question is, why do you think that because the ultra vires doctrine is something new, relatively new in European jurisprudence, and my question is why it was developed? Because we could manage without ultra vires for, I don't know, 40 years of European integration, and suddenly there it is.
Well, that begs the question. We could manage. The fact that we did it doesn't mean that it was right. So you say you're very critical of the decision of the Constitutional Court here. And you should be critical because it's a problematic decision. But the real question is, if it was only the Czech court, if it was only the Polish court, which has an even worse decision, you could say, they don't understand Europe, it's just another Schweikism, it's a legal Schweikism.
I think they understand that. That's the reason why it's Schweikism.
So then your criticism should be a little bit different, because the question is, why do we suddenly see this in a decision by a Danish court, in a decision by an Italian court, in a decision by the Conseil d'État in France, in a decision by a Polish court, by a Czech court, by a Romanian court, etc.? What's happening? The fact that it's so many courts with different backgrounds from different countries, and you can look at every decision and criticize it. The Weiss decision from Germany is a bad decision in legal terms. But the question is, why are they doing that? What are pressing the Supreme Courts of so many member states to say enough is enough? So let's talk about ultra vires. The fact of the matter is that the European Union only has the power that are given to it by the member states in the treaties. Now, when I teach European law, I always ask my students a trick question. Define for me or explain to me the principle of supremacy. And every year, with no exception, somebody raises their hand and gives the wrong answer, which I like. Supremacy means that European Union law is supreme over member state law. Why is that a wrong answer? The correct answer is European Union law is supreme over member state law only in the legitimate sphere of competence of the European Union. If the European Union exceeds its competence in legalese when it acts ultra vires, the principle of supremacy should not apply because it exceeds its competences. So now let's go back to the previous question. So why are we seeing so many states in the last 5-10 years taking these decisions of which you are critical? It's a socio-legal answer, in part, because they don't think that the European Court of Justice, admirable as it is, and I admire it, has done a good job in policing the jurisdictional limits of the European Union. And therefore, in a way, they are making a statement. If they don't do it, we will do it. Can we be a little bit more legal?
Of course. This is a legal podcast.
The principle of delegated power, which is just another way of saying ultra vires, intra vires, is a complicated issue from a position of constitutional law in two ways. In one way, it's a matter of national constitutional law. What do you do if a Supreme Court, if a constitutional court says the European Union is acting ultra vires because we could not have given it that power because that would violate our constitution? It's a legitimate position. We could not have given it that power because to give it that power would violate our own constitution. On the other hand, ultra vires, from a conceptual point of view, but also from a practical point of view, has to be a European principle, because we cannot have a situation where the Czech court or the German court or the Italian court will say the European Union is acting ultra vires because we could not have delegated that power to the European Union. It violates our constitution, the Italian decision in Tarico.
Mm-hmm.
And the French court would say it's intra vires. So the European Union law would be valid in France and invalid in Italy. And that would violate the principle of equality before the law. So how do we resolve this? On the one hand, we say that intra vires, ultra vires has a dimension which is national law and European law. On the other hand, we say it has to be the European Court of Justice which decides, otherwise it would violate the principle of equality before the law if every member state gets to decide what is intra vires, ultra vires. The problem would not have arisen if the European Court of Justice would be seen to be an effective federal court. Now, the word federalism in Europe is misunderstood. Federalism means Brussels. A federal Europe means a centralized Europe. That's not true. Federalism means a division between member states and the federation and the federal power. So how do we solve this? So, together with a Spanish colleague, we made a proposal. We said it has to be a decision of the European Court of Justice because we cannot have one decision in Italy and another decision in Poland. But for purposes of deciding intra vires, ultra vires, a new chamber should be established, a chamber of the European Court of Justice. So it's the European Court of Justice deciding. The composition of that chamber for the purposes of intra vires, ultra vires, has to be different. It should have 12 members, 6 judges of the European Court of Justice, and 6 judges who are sitting members of the constitutional courts of the member states. And they should decide what is intra vires, ultra vires. And in our proposal, it can only be decided that it's intra vires if at least 2 of the constitutional court judges sitting in this chamber are part of the majority that say intra vires. The importance of this is both practical, that when you decide that issue, the body that is deciding it will understand that this is a question that involves both national constitutional law and European constitutional law, and B, it's symbolic. If that chamber decides that it's intra vires, nobody can argue that there is jurisdictional creep, that the European Union is acting ultra vires, is acting beyond its delegated powers, it's acting beyond its constitutional competences. So we made this proposal. It received huge attention. There was even a hearing in the European Parliament, which I participated in. And there was a hearing in the Council of Europe, the Parliamentary Assembly. The initial reaction from the European Court of Justice was very negative. No, 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 no. But recently, we call this the mixed chamber. Mixed chamber, Constitutional Court judges, European Court judges. Recently, in the famous document presented just a few weeks ago by the French and German government, they propose a mixed chamber. So that shows you that instead of saying, I'm critical of this decision, blah, 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 the question has to be, why are so many courts going in that direction? And what should we do about it? And my proposal is the mixed chamber. Will it solve the problem? Absolutely. No. You could still have a national court which says we disregard the mixed chamber, but it's much less likely. It would be much more difficult for a national court to say this is ultra vires if a chamber composed of national constitutional court judges and European court judges say it's intra vires. But the issue of intra vires, ultra vires, it's not new. It's been with us. It's at the heart of the constitutional structure of the European Union. It's just been disregarded, and now we are paying the price for it.
I will have a follow-up question, because how do you see, for example, the ECJ's review of principle of subsidiarity? Because that's one of the principles which was mentioned a lot during the Lisbon Treaty adoption. But if we are going through the caseload of ECJ, there is basically no decision when the ECJ would say, okay, this is violation of principle of subsidiarity. So, and a lot of scholars are actually claiming that the ECJ is the engine of integration. So it's very hard to give him competence to review the subsidiarity. It's impossible job to do, to combine those two roles.
There are 2 issues here. First of all, I am skeptical. I like the idea of subsidiarity. It comes from Catholic social doctrine from the 1930s. The principle of subsidiarity says decisions should be taken closest to the area where they have an impact. But it's not justiciable. The German Constitutional Court also, there's subsidiarity, but they say it's not justiciable. The United States Supreme Court, it's not justiciable. I don't think subsidiarity in and of itself is a justiciable concept. It should be normal constitution. Were these delegated powers? Was this power delegated, etc.? So I'm not critical of the fact that they don't use subsidiarity. And my prediction is if they did use subsidiarity, they would always find in favor of Europe, which is the second point you raised. You said the European Court is the engine of integration, and historically it has been. But what the European Court has to recalibrate itself. What does European integration mean? And in its concept, and this is very common, European integration means more integration is always better. More centralization is always better. Every problem we have, if the European Union can decide, it's better for European integration. That is a huge mistake, because integration does not mean centralization. So the European Court of Justice should continue and remain an engine of integration, but it has to recalibrate and re-understand what integration means. Integration does not mean that anything that could be done by Brussels should be done by Brussels. That's the problem of the European Court. And that's why so many national constitutional courts, not only the Czech, are saying enough is enough.
Do you think that it's also connected with selection of judges? Because if you are looking for a judge for ECJ or the General Court, you are usually looking for somebody who has knowledge of European law. So there might be, let's say, bias towards the European Union, and it's hard to imagine that, for example, somebody who is openly Eurosceptic or Eurocritical or Euro-pessimistic will be appointed to be a judge of European Court Justice.
But you note the contradiction in your question. Because
I'm trying to provoke.
That's okay. The first part of your question equates knowledge of European law with adopting that notion of European integration. It's always better if Brussels does it. But you can be very knowledgeable of European law. I consider myself reasonably knowledgeable of European law. And yet I have a different conception of what European integration means. That's the first part of my answer to the question. The second part is the following. Very often in the history of the European Court of Justice, countries have sent judges who, on the one hand, are knowledgeable of European law, and they should be, but they were sent, you will defend the national interest, etc. The political scientists call it the theory of constructivism. They go to the European Court with that idea, and after 6 months, they are co-opted into the ethos of the 60s and 70s of the European Court of Justice.
I think it's called Beckett syndrome.
Correct. And that's why we suggested the mixed chamber. Because if you send national constitutional judges to the mixed chamber, their reference group are not the other European Court judges, they are judges in national constitutional court. There will be a healthy conversation. But we should not confuse knowledgeable of European law. You can be knowledgeable of European law. Because you're knowledgeable of European law, you can be, I don't like the word Eurosceptic, but have a critical view of what European integration means.
Thank you, Professor. It was a pleasure to have you, and it was also a great honor.
It's my pleasure, really. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to see you again in Prague. Cink, 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 dostali jste se na konec epizody a moc děkujeme za to, že jste nás poslouchali až do konce.
Určitě nám dejte like, určitě nás odebírejte a budeme se na vás těšit při příštím díle.
A pokud se vám díl líbil, pošlete nám zpětnou vazbu, pošlete nám to na e-mail z evropy@perfecciony.cz, pošlete to svým známým, hoďte si to do storíčka na Instagramu, cokoliv. Budeme za to moc rádi, jak se to dostane co k největšímu množství lidí, které by to mohlo zajímat.
Děkujeme, mějte se hezky.